Right, well, hello, a chroeso I bawb i'r Llyfrgell. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the National Library of Wales and to this event. This is the latest of extremely popular talks by a photographic curator, Wil Troughton. We have held in connection with the exhibition. Part of it is still there on upstairs in the main hall. Aberystwyth on camera, photographs by Pickford, 1880 till 1970. So if you haven't seen it, and I'm sure a lot of you will have by now, there is still part of the exhibition there to see. So Wil, as part of the actual exhibit, has been giving talks here in the Drum because of popular demand and sell-out tours, and also around the exhibition. I'm Rhian Gibson, Director of Communications, and it's part of my job usually as to welcome people to different talks in the library. Sometimes it's a job, but welcoming people to Wil's talks, especially on the Pickfords collection, is an absolute delight. I've loved every one of them, and I am Wil's main groupie at the moment. The talk today is about Aberystwyth, Harbour and the RNLI. Wil will look at both the history of the Harbour and of the RNLI separately and together, illustrated with photographs from Gwyn Martin, Arthur Lewis, Pickfords and others. I was telling Wil, beginning of the week, I was brought up in Trefechan. I spent most of my time with my grandmother in Glanrafon Terrace in Trefechan, and I used to swim from the old railway bridge into the harbour when I was about 7 years old, which is a long time ago. And I was thinking, you know, health and safety must not have been on a vocabulary then. But I actually, knowing I was here today, went to the harbour on that one night. We had 2 hours of dry weather. And you just look at the harbour now, and I was thinking 50 years ago how different it is, how things have changed. I was getting quite nostalgic about it. So I'm very, very much looking forward to hearing all about the harbour and the RNLI. So welcome, Wil, and let's all enjoy the next hour.
Thank you, Rhian. Thank you for coming. I hope you'll enjoy the talk. I'll start off explaining what we've got here. The older picture is by Glyn Pickford. It's from 1934. It's a series he took from the air when the flying circus came to Aberystwyth, and you would pay your 10 shillings for half an hour's spin in the air. And Glyn Pickford's gone up, and there's about 4 or 5 pictures that he's taken. There's this wonderful one of the harbour. And my colleague Scott Waby, who's a bit of an expert with drones, has kindly taken this new image. I don't know when he found this sort of a fine day to do it, but he assures me it was taken recently. So this is our harbour. Look at it in a bit closer detail. You can see it's dominated by the 165 berth marina, which is for sale. On the town quay, we can just see some of the small fleet of inshore fishing boats. They're almost exclusively engaged in fishing for shellfish, lobsters, prawns, scallops and crabs. There are no charter boats, there are no trips in the bay anymore. Neither is there anything to show of the 279 ships that were built here between 1780 and 1881. Some were small fishing boats, perhaps less than 20 tons or so, would be crewed by perhaps 2 or 3 men, up to the largest, which was the Caroline Spooner, built in 1878 and 663 tons. If you're not quite sure how big that would be, if you've been to Greenwich and you've seen the Cutty Sark, that's 931 tons, so it gives you some idea. It was a large vessel. It had a crew of about 20. Likewise, there's very little to suggest there were over 600 vessels registered in Aberystwyth between 1863 and 1917. The largest of these was 2,650 tons. It was called the Rugbeian, and it was one of the Cambrian Steamship Company's tramp steamers. It was far too big to ever enter the harbour here, but it was administered, like the rest of the company, from Cambrian Chambers in Cambrian Place, which is next door to Charlie's. If you look next time you're there, it still says Cambrian Chambers above the door. Crew agreements for these 600 vessels, listing the crew, their previous vessel, their age, wages, the voyages, their provisions, and sometimes even more, are all to be found here in the National Library of Wales. That's about 1/3 of them. So each of these 600 vessels would have either home trade agreement, which lasted for 6 months at a time, or foreign going, which could last for a few months, up until well over a year. So although there's 600 vessels, there's well more than 600 of these crew agreements. And sometimes, apart from things like names, ages, and so forth of the seamen, there are other details. This is one in particular. This is Rhys Lloyd. He was ship's carpenter on board the Prairie Flower. He passed away on board the ship, and the captain had to list all his tools and effects. And you can see them there. And I don't know, I won't go through them all, but you can see there 7-gauge chisels, 12 corking irons, 2 turn screws, all the equipment that he would have used as a ship's carpenter, as well as his own personal possessions. Now, first, reference to anything that might resemble a harbour in Aberystwyth can be dated back to 1206, when that very rare commodity, prosperity, visited Aberystwyth. And it was said, there came to the mouth of the Ystwyth such an abundance of fish that their like was never heard of. The harbour, of course, at this time was little more than a river mouth and a shingle bank offering some protection from storms. It's not even clear at this time if the rivers Ystwyth and Rheidol converged before entering the sea. By 1277, we must assume that when construction of the castle started, there must have been reasonable facilities for unloading. We know that building materials arrived from Bristol, from Carmarthen and Milford Haven, along with 1,300 workmen to do the work, as well as supplies for the garrison. The harbour was also instrumental in supplying the castle during times of siege, such as by Owain Glyndwr between 1402 and 1404. In 1561, it was described as a barred haven of no value, this being a reference to the entrance to the harbour that restricted access at certain states of the tide. It's a situation that persists to an extent to the present day. The bar forms where the rivers Rheidol and Ystwyth meet the sea. Their velocity is checked, and any material carried in suspension or being rolled along the riverbed will be deposited. In addition, where fresh water meets the seawater, flocculation occurs, which causes small particles held in suspension to bond together, becoming heavier and falling to the sea floor, either as ooze or as mud. Nearly 200 years later, Lewis Morris surveyed the harbour in 1745, and he recorded that the bar is dry at low water, heightens to about 11 feet at spring tide, shifting banks of gravel. Though this didn't stop cargoes leaving, cargoes of lead ore at this time were being exported from the area, and also during the English Civil War, we can assume that the silver coin that was minted in the castle also went out by ship. This is a view from 1792 by Julius Caesar Ibbotson. It shows the harbour as it would have looked not just in 1792, but probably in Lewis Morris's time and perhaps for centuries before that. On the left, you can see a row vow, the shingle bank, and that would have offered some protection to ships sheltering there, but it could be breached in storms and they could be damaged or even wrecked as a result of a particularly ferocious storm. So it wasn't a very prepossessing place. You can see the fairly small boats that would have operated there, single-masted, probably with a half-deck. These are the kind of boats that would have been used probably for herring fishing for part of the year, then probably laid up from January through to March, April. Then they would have been involved in the coasting trade until the start of the next herring season, which would usually be in about September or so. They're probably somewhere between 15 and 60 tons. They varied a little bit in size, but the construction at the mouth of the harbour tended to rule how big the boats could be. They'd have traded perhaps with Swansea, Bristol, Liverpool, Dublin. They would have been sort of just ports along the coast, really, of Wales up to Liverpool and over to Ireland. In 1780, an Act of Parliament was obtained, and this allowed the town to repair, enlarge and preserve the harbour. The harbour trustees were granted borrowing powers, and once appointed, they met regularly in taverns in the town, and they spent little on improving the harbour. The list of public houses they met in is truly phenomenal. All they were really interested in doing was spending perhaps a shilling here or a couple of pounds to dig a trench somewhere else. So they didn't do anything decisive whatsoever. This is from about 1840. It's by an artist known as the Welsh Primitive. That's because the style is primitive and we don't actually know who the artist was. It's quite a tantalising riddle, really. But this shows the type of vessel that, up until the 1830s or so, would have been prevalent in Aberystwyth. Single-masted, you can see there's a crew of, 3 men on there. You can see some of the other smaller boats. I think you can see what I imagine are pieces of wood sticking out of there, which might have been there to mark the best channel. Imports at this time included barrel staves and salt, which were for salting and storing herring, coal, and especially cume or coal dust from South Wales. Other things imported were limestone for the lime kilns, slates from North Wales, household goods, and increasingly timber. Coal dust was the fuel of the poor, and it was also mixed with limestone in the kilns around the harbour to produce lime for spreading on the fields. Exports other than herring were lead and zinc ores, oak bark, which was used in tanning, a lot of that went over to Ireland, and oak poles, which were used in coal mines as props. But the real impetus from change came in 1834. The harbour was by now in a deplorable state, with vessels often dependent on a particularly high tide to either enter or leave. An engineer named George Bush was engaged, and it was his idea to build a strong stone wall at the south of the channel to increase the scour of the Ystwyth and Trydol rivers. It took years to achieve. It was built initially with quite soft stone from Allwen to the south of Tenebulch Beach. We can see there the tram that would have been taking rocks to and from the breakwater. It had to rebuild in 1867. Fortunately, they found a source of stronger stone below Allwen, so they were able to use that, which I'm sure kept the costs down. The contraption you can see there, with the ball there, that was used to signal to ships out at sea as to the state of the tide. It could be raised and lowered to indicate to ships when it was safe to enter the harbour or not, as the case may be. The effect of Bush's stone pier was to remove the sandbar that blocked the harbour. By washing the sand further out, it allowed bigger vessels to enter and leave the harbour. This in turn led to a boom in shipbuilding. During the 1830s, the average vessel built in Aberystwyth was 61 tonnes. By the 1850s, it had risen to 96, and by the 1870s, it was 169 tonnes. In 1841, there were over 150 vessels registered in the town, making Aberystwyth a far greater port than Cardiff. But the harbour did have its drawbacks. Throughout its working life, the harbour entrance has always proved troublesome, as you can see from this map. Boulders near the entrance, shifting sandbanks, and the trap to the north of the entrance, when combined with unfavourable tides and winds, have all claimed victims. All those vessels you can see bracketed there have come to grief after attempting to enter the Aberystwyth harbour. So it wasn't an easy harbour to enter, specifically at poor times of the year or at a poor state of the tide. There aren't many details of vessels that were wrecked there, probably because a lot of the wrecks happened at night. But we have got details of this one particular one. This is the John and Mary from Borth. It was built in 1842. It was named after the captain's parents. It was sailing from Neath to Aberdyfi with coal dust, but rough weather had damaged the steering gear, so instead of aiming for Aberdyfi, she aimed for Aberystwyth instead. But she ended up grounding on Roa Fawr, on that shingle bank that we saw earlier in the Ibbotson painting. It was only 10 metres from shore, but the conditions were so rough that onlookers were unable to offer any help and attempt a rescue. In the picture, we can see Captain Evan Hughes, who was dangling from a rope. Shortly afterwards, the ship was hit by a particularly big wave. It lurched over and causing the hatch that we can see above his head to open, and the cargo spilled out and suffocated the captain. The mate, too, was drowned, while both men that we see up in the rigging were eventually rescued. Earlier I mentioned that 279 ships were built between 1780 and 1881. Shipbuilding was carried on that part of the harbour known variously as the Gilan or the Gap, which we can see here. You can see on the left-hand side there, you can see that there's a white-hulled vessel there on the blocks there approaching completion. You can see there's a couple of others there, further over to the left again. We can date this reasonably accurately. Tanakai Sunday School was built in 1875, and that's not there. But you can also see that the old college, there seems to be construction work going on. It looks like the scaffolding there. So we can date this to about circa 1870. Shortly after this was taken, the harbour started to suffer from the arrival of the railway. In 1864, the railway started to bring in many goods which previously would have been imported by ship. Some cargoes were relatively unaffected. Things like timber, fertiliser, granite sets for pavements, roadstone, slates, mainly bulk goods that could probably stand getting wet. It wouldn't be the end of the world if they got wet. Cement continued to come in by ship, and also cargoes of potatoes from Ireland. Railways, of course, had the advantage of not being at the whim of tides and winds, and therefore their arrival could be predicted. I'm saying that with a tongue-in-cheek, bearing in mind Transport for Wales, but their arrival could usually be predicted fairly accurately. Sailing ships were also under pressure from steamships as well, because again, they were not so at the whims of tides and winds, and that they could stick to a fairly regular timetable. But however, the presence of the harbour also continued to have a moderating influence on freight rates by the railway companies. If the railway companies put up their rates too much, then it was cheaper to bring things in by ship, so there was always going to be an equilibrium there. For a while also, there was an extension from the Aberystwyth to Carmarthen line along St David's Quay that doesn't seem to have been used a great deal. This is another view of shipbuilding. This is by local artist Alfred Worthington. Again, we can date this reasonably accurately. You can see Tanysai Sunday School there on the far left. That was built in 1875. If we look on the right-hand side there, I'm sure, as you know, most houses in Aberystwyth were built of stone, a lot of it robbed from the castle. So there were very few brick buildings, but we know that in 1867, David Roberts, the brewer, imported 54 tons of bricks. And these were used for building the malt kiln that you can see on the right-hand side there. In the middle is the old Trevechan Bridge, the arched Trevechan Bridge, which was washed away in 1886. If you go up to the Pickfords exhibition, you can see a photo of the bridge just after it had been washed away. That would have been taken by Gide, who was Pickford's predecessor. You can see here there's, I think, 1, 2, 3 ships on the blocks there being built. So it's rather slightly stylised, but I think it's a very good representation of Aberystwyth Harbour. In 1880, Slater's Trades Directory listed the trade of Aberystwyth Harbour as follows. The shipping business consists in the exportation of lead and silver ore and a small quantity of copper ore. The imports are timber, shop goods and other merchandises from Liverpool, Bristol and London. Groceries, coals, slates and slabs, flagging, bricks, flour, fish, limestone, etc. I'm not quite sure why Aberystwyth would have imported fish, to be honest, but there we are. There are 3 shipbuilding establishments, an old established rope walk, a sail manufactory, steam sawmills, and a large engineering and iron and brass foundry. The number of vessels belonging to the port on 10th of January 1877 was 292 sailing and 3 steamships, total 295 with a tonnage of 37,944. So you can see it was still quite a prosperous port. I've chosen sort of not quite at random, but 3 Aberystwyth vessels to indicate the type of trade they were involved in. My method of choosing this was the fact that I had illustrations of all 3 of them, so it's not particularly scientific, but I hope you like the illustrations anyway. This is J. Llewellyn. It was a 161-ton brigantine. It was launched from the yard of Jones and Williams on a Geylan on Aberystwyth, 4th September 1869, by a Mrs. Llewellyn from Hay-on-Wye, and I think we can presume that she was related to the master and major shareholder, Captain William Llewellyn. Ship launches in the town were always a great occasion, with the workers given the day off and local school children brought down to watch the fun. Her first voyage from Aberystwyth was to Newport, presumably in ballast, where she loaded with coal and then sailed for Cagliari and then Barcelona, and stopping off on the way back at the Scilly Isles, and the latter was possibly to discharge a rather unruly crew member. You'll have to look at the crew agreements for the full details. Her next 2 voyages were to the Caribbean, which at the time was dominated by the sugar industry. The first of these voyages was to Berbice, in present-day Guyana. A contemporary guidebook noting that mosquitoes abound here. One suspects the crew probably found that out for themselves. The second voyage to the Caribbean was to Grenada, 43 days on the outward leg, 32 2 days on the return leg to London. Most of the trips from the Caribbean were to refineries either in Glasgow or London. The next 2 voyages took her south of the equator to Port Alfred on the Cowie River in South Africa. She was one of a number of Aberystwyth vessels that sailed to Port Alfred during the 1860s and 1870s, and these included Curadur Howendale, Maggie Phillips, Patriot, Retriever and Star of Wales. Port Alfred, I think it was perhaps a bit like Aberystwyth in that it had a poor reputation among sailors as it was a very difficult port to enter. Here she seems to have been importing general goods, as I came across some contemporary newspaper advertisements listing the kind of household goods that you would expect to be imported. I think sewing machines is one of the items that was listed as being specific to J. Llewellyn. She then returned to the Caribbean, taking cargoes of sugar before departing Cardiff for Cadiz with a cargo of coal, picking up a cargo of salt in Cadiz for Newfoundland, which would be used to salt cod. She then left Greenspond, Newfoundland, with a cargo of copper ore for Swansea. Her next voyage was similar, bringing copper ore from Tilt Cove in Newfoundland. She then went to Safi in Morocco for beans, Setts Cove in Newfoundland for copper ore, Berbice, Barbados and St. Lucia for sugar. Further trips followed to the Mediterranean and the Caribbean, and on one occasion, in 1881, she lost 4 members of the crew in Berbice. One was drowned, another succumbed to disease, and 2 were left behind in hospital. The West India Pocket Book, Book 2, published in 1880, quotes the following statistics for Berbice. In 1876, dysentery and diarrhea killed 1,160, consumption 576, and fever 915. The place had a population of 35,000, so it was one of the healthiest places to go to. This poor ship's demise came in 1885 when she was loading another cargo of beans at Safi in Morocco, which were due to be delivered either to Falmouth or Queenstown. She was blown ashore in a terrific gale, the crew escaping with their lives and most of their possessions. Due to quarantine regulations, they then had to live in a makeshift tent on the beach. 5 days later, another Aberystwyth vessel, the 340-ton Solway, captained by Samuel Jones from 24 Mill Street, was wrecked in the same place. I've spoken to members of descendants of the family, and they said that there's sort of a legend within the family that it was actually refloated afterwards, but I've not found any evidence to see that this was the case. This is another Aberystwyth vessel, the Hope. She was a Canadian-built ship, launched in 1865, 116 feet long and 26.3 feet across, and she was initially capable of carrying 276 tons of cargo. That was later downgraded to 248. That was due to a change in legislation, which meant that you actually had to have accommodation for the crew rather than expecting them to squeeze in wherever there was space. It's worth noting, I think, that Canadian vessels were cheaper to build than British vessels, but they were regarded as not having such a long life. Hope was acquired by Thomas Jones, who was a timber merchant and a son of Thomas Jones, the rope maker. He was bought in 1871, and probably with a view to replacing Credo, which was another timber ship that had served the town for about 36 years, but which sank in 1872. Both were involved in importing timber to Aberystwyth from ports in Scandinavia and from North America. With shipbuilding, lead mining and house building all requiring timber, there were between 8 and 10 shiploads of timber imported into Aberystwyth every year. Most of the wood from Scandinavia was used in the lead mines, while the wood from North America tended to be used for shipbuilding. Once lead mining and shipbuilding declined locally, cargoes of timber that Hope imported tend to be either for Porthmadog or for the Isle of Man. Hope, which we see here, crossed the Atlantic at least 69 times. Destinations included Darien in Georgia, Dalhousie in New Brunswick, Halifax, Nova Scotia, St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands, and Quebec, as well as one trip each year to Scandinavia. This is Hope again, unloading a cargo of timber. You can see that the timber was in 2 forms. You've got sort of what look like literally parts of tree trunks there, but you've got the deals, the planks of wood as well. The end of Hope came in hurricane force winds when 60 miles off Cape Race in Canada in 1892. She was carrying a cargo of timber from Dalhousie for Porthmadog. The ship started to leak and it gained on the pumps. Hope was carrying deck cargo, and this, I think, was partly responsible for her capsizing. To counterbalance the cargo of standards of birch below decks, she was carrying 13 tiers of deals on her starboard side and 14 on the port side. All were secured by chains. But in the rough weather, the deck cargo got loose. This hampered the crew as they tried to move around the vessel. Attempts were made to jettison the cargo, but with the ship rolling and pitching and the deck cargo loose, this proved too dangerous. And eventually, the ship capsized, most of the crew clinging onto the hull until being washed off. 3 of the crew managed to tie some of the deck cargo together, made a raft, and were rescued by a fishing vessel after 4 days adrift. This far smaller vessel, this schooner Squirrel, was built in Bristol in 1862. She was just under 100 tons, so a lot smaller than J. Llewellyn and a lot smaller than Hope. She was owned by Captain Richard Edwards, says on the bottom there, and her usual complement of crew was 4 or 5. Very often, Captain Edwards would take with him local crew. Nearly all her voyages commenced from South Wales port, from which we can surmise that she was taking cargoes of coal. She made 1 voyage each year to a port in Ireland. Sometimes it was Skibbereen, sometimes Kinmary, sometimes it was Waterford. She went down to the Mediterranean to coal stations such as Gibraltar. She was visited Figueira in Portugal, Lisbon and Valencia, and occasionally Morocco. During the 1880s, she made a number of trips from Porthmadog carrying slates over to Hamburg. There was quite a big trading link between Porthmadog and Hamburg. There had been a fire in Hamburg in 1852, which involved rebuilding most of the city. And so a lot of slates were exported from Porthmadog to help in the rebuilding. And that trading link continued right up until the First World War. Well, she also visited Huelva, again, probably for copper ore. These are 3 examples of Aberystwyth registered ships. As I mentioned before, there are over 600. Others, such as Credo and Tamerlane, were involved in taking emigrants to North America. Ralph Waller was built in New Brunswick in 1854. She was over 1,000 tons, registered in Aberystwyth, and captained by Captain Daniel Lewis of Penmaes Glass. Her maiden voyage was from Liverpool. On January the 5th, 1855, she left for a non-stop journey to Melbourne with 40 crew and 180 passengers. She arrived in Melbourne in April, but nearly sank after hitting an iceberg. If you go online and type in Ralph Waller diary, you'll find there's a transcript of a diary that was kept by one of the passengers on Ralph Waller. And as they were approaching Australia, they were still in the Southern Ocean, about 1,000 miles from land, they bumped into an iceberg. The ship took on 15 feet of water in 15 minutes. And everybody thought that the boat was going to go down. But due to the efforts of the ship's carpenter and the captain, they managed to stabilise things and eventually got most of the water out and were able to make it to Melbourne. As thanks to Mr. Bowen, the ship's carpenter, he was presented with a purse of gold sovereigns when they got to Melbourne. Sadly, I don't think it did him much good because the Ralph Waller was last heard of in January 1856 off the Chincha Islands near Peru and is presumed to have been lost with all hands after that. I think she was carrying a cargo of coal, and coal could self-ignite, so if there were no other ships around to rescue them at the time, then that was it. Their fate was sealed. Where possible, Aberystwyth captains, like Captain Edwards, would prefer to hire a local crew. Local seamen were more dependable than those picked up along the way, who may have been, and often were, of an atrocious character. Something was known of the character of men from local families, and having strong ties to their communities, they were less likely to misbehave or to desert their ship in a foreign port. Many stayed with the same captain and ship for numerous voyages. Some vessels, for example the Curadur of Aberystwyth, were known for having a well-speaking captain and crew, and in fact the ship was well-speaking. The captain of Caroline Spooner, the largest vessel built in Aberystwyth, we mentioned before, had far more challenges than the master of perhaps a small trading vessel. Caroline Spooner was a Cape Horner. She sailed to South America and Australia with a crew of over 20 men. She was condemned in Chile in 1898, but refloated and named Osceola. Her crew agreements as Caroline Spooner are here, and they make interesting reading. It seems her multinational crew were liberally distributed in prisons and hospitals right across the region. I will quote one extreme example as to why a local crew was desirable, and that's a vessel called the Prince Llewellyn, which was built in 1858 and captained by David Davis from Aberystwyth. She left Pernambuco in Brazil. She had been certified as seaworthy by the insurance agent, and she sailed for New York with 6,500 bags of sugar. Some of it was listed as green sugar, i.e. raw sugar cane. Prior to that, she'd sailed from Glasgow to Rio with 450 tons of coal, and then on to Rio to Pernambuco, without any incident whatsoever. But it's noted that this green sugar tended to weep and give off a sticky liquid. Elements of the crew who had joined the ship in Pernambuco complained that the ship was leaking. Attempting to pump out the water, this sticky molasses from the sugar kept blocking the pumps. The captain promised that he would put into Barbados if the problems continued, but expected the men to work the pumps meantime. The captain then decided he didn't need to go to Barbados. These same elements of the crew became unruly and mutinous, insisting the ship was unseaworthy. The new crew members used a caulking iron to make a hole 12 inches long and 1/4 of an inch wide below the waterline. Not a sensible thing to do, really. This was witnessed by another member of the crew, Thomas White, but he was told by Thomas Rains, who was the eldest and the ringleader of the mutineers, that he was either to keep quiet or he'd have his heart cut out. So, this hole was supposedly made with a view to make the captain put into port, but as a result, the vessel had to be abandoned shortly afterwards, 10 miles away from St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands. Thomas Rains, Alfred Slade and John James Ingram were placed under arrest, and I quote, until they could be conveyed to a British possession, there to be tried on the charge of having mutinied while on the voyage from Pernambuco to New York in the British ship Prince Llewellyn of Aberystwyth, official number 21,754, and with having injured her, firstly with the object of compelling the master to make for a port, and secondly as having scuttled her with the object of sinking her, so as to conceal their criminality. They were then conveyed by mail boat to Southampton. The case came to court in July 1883, and surprisingly all three were acquitted, as there was insufficient evidence to corroborate Thomas White's statement. I can't help but a degree of sympathy for Thomas White here, because he must have been going around with one eye in the back of his head for the rest of his career, because there were 3 guys who would probably very happily have knifed him given the chance. So one does feel a little for him, really. This is another Alfred Worthington painting. It shows the steamer Countess of Lisburn towing 2 fishing boats out of Aberystwyth Harbour. As mentioned before, the harbour's decline really started in the 1880s with the end of shipbuilding and the downturn in lead mining. Steamships were becoming increasingly common, with Aberystwyth served by firstly the Aberystwyth and Cardigan Bay Steam Packet Company Limited, and later the Aberystwyth and Aberdyfi Steam Packet Co Limited, who operated firstly the Countess of Lisburn that we see here, up until from 1886 to 1908, and then later by a new vessel called the Grosvenor from 1908 to 1915. These vessels maintained a service between Liverpool and Aberystwyth, with occasional calls elsewhere. Grosvenor was sold in 1915, by the way. She'd been bought in 1908, but by 1915, because of the First World War and merchant ships being sunk, the price of second-hand vessels rose. So they decided to sell Grosvenor at a profit in 1915, which makes sense because otherwise they were risking losing her. So that's why the packet company came to an end. What have I got to? Yeah. Post-World War I, commerce really dwindled to a trickle. It was confined to occasional cargoes of timber and occasional cargoes from tramp steamers. This was a situation that persisted right through to the 1930s, but fortunately, Arthur Lewis was here to photograph most of them. Oh, this is the last cargo that came into Aberystwyth. This is in May 1987, a vessel called the Sarah M, which came with a cargo of timber for Ystwyth Homes for building timber-framed houses. This is one of Arthur Lewis's. This is from 1927. This is a Belgian steamer called the Mons. It was the largest ship ever to enter Aberystwyth Harbour. 2 other vessels came in at the same time, the Clarine, who we'll see in a minute, and the Rockingham, which is a small Irish schooner. Rockingham sailed from Aberystwyth, but it was abandoned in Newquay. The crew refused to sail any further, which makes one suspect that she was probably unseaworthy. Notice the Vale of Rydal extension to the railway line in the front of the picture. This is another of the steamers that came in. I think it's probably the Glenshesque. It's not quite clear on the bow of the vessel or the name of it. So again, quite a large vessel to come into Aberystwyth. This is Clarine. It came in on the same tide as the Mons that we saw earlier. Unfortunately, it collided with the stone jetty on the way in and was ultimately written off. Many years ago, I interviewed a gentleman called Watty Chamberlain, who had been born and brought up in Trefechan. He was born in 1906, and he was telling me that if he and his friends wanted to go to the cinema, they'd go to this part of the harbour there, and they would grub around in the mud looking for copper nails. if they got enough copper nails to fill a jam jar, they would take that to the local scrap merchant, and that would pay for the money for them to go into the cinema. This is one of the Scandinavian timber ships that came, usually perhaps one cargo a year, came into Aberystwyth. If you look at the stern of the vessel, you can see the sort of decoration which is characteristic of Scandinavian vessels. Unfortunately, it's too dark to work out exactly the name of the vessel. And this gentleman here was Teddy James. He operated a ferry service across the harbour during the summer months. As you can see, they're all wearing life jackets. It's all perfectly safe. This is one of nice tranquil view by Glyn Pickford from circa 1960. This is another view again. And you can see the mud flats with just a scattering of pleasure boats. You can see Friedel Place there on the left-hand side, which was later demolished. Glyn Pickford also, fortunately, took many photos of Williams Brothers boat builders. They operated out of premises in Trevechan, just on the fire station. They were going in business till about, I think, 1959 or so, I think, when they finished. One of their stock in trade was ships' lifeboats, and during the Second World War, they're estimated to have built over 400 ships' lifeboats, which were sent out to various merchant vessels. They also built a number of small fishing boats. This is one of them, Anus Enlli, which was working up in Aberystwyth Harbour until the 1990s. I've been told that it's still around, but not in Aberystwyth. Another vessel that some people might remember was Silver Wake, which was the last vessel that they built as well. We're also fortunate to have the Gwyn Martin collection in the National Library. Gwyn Martin lived in South Mean Terrace. He was a pharmacist by trade. He operated Taylor Lloyd's Chemists, but he was also a very keen photographer. He took literally hundreds of photographs of the harbour and environs, which are here in the library. Some of you might have a copy of a book of his photographs, A Stroll Around the Harbour, which was published posthumously and features many of the characters that he encountered around the harbour. A quick look at some of his views. That's the Golden Rake. Oh, we're on too far. That's Jackie Jenkins, known as Jackie the Monster. You have to buy the book if you want to know why. He was just a character that Gwyn Martin photographed on numerous occasions. That's the lower harbour there before St David's Quay was developed. You've got the fire station there, which is looking quite new. And then you've got this view again. You can see again Rydal Place, so it's about 1960. You won't see any dinghy sailing in that part of the harbour for a long, long time. There's the Western Seas, AB 42. That sank off Bourth in about 1977, I think. The nets got tangled around the propeller. And I think that gentleman there might be Tony Maylett. It's difficult to see, but it does bear a striking resemblance to him. Gwyn Martin was also a member of the lifeboat crew, and he was a keen supporter of the RNLI, which brings me on to the second part of the talk. As you know, the town's lifeboat is housed in the harbour, but that's not always been the case. To see how it arrived in the harbour, I think we need to go back to look at the origins of the RNLI in Aberystwyth. As it's the 200th anniversary of the RNLI, it seems quite appropriate. The first record of a boat to save life at Aberystwyth dates back to 1843, when a 6-oared boat was purchased by public subscription and placed under the management of the harbour master, and presumably kept at the harbour. But in 1861, the RNLI took over the service, and the elderly 6-oared boat was replaced by a 10-oared boat, the self-righting Evelyn Wood. Initially, the lifeboat was kept in a boathouse on Victoria Terrace and launched from a nearby slipway. So I think that is probably the shed that you see in the middle of the older photo. Evelyn Wood lasted 15 years and was then replaced by a larger boat, the 35-foot Lady Haberfield, which required the expenditure of £200 on a new boathouse in Queen's Road, which we see there. A succession of similarly dimensioned self-righting pulling and sailing lifeboats followed. There was a second Lady Haberfield, an Elizabeth Lloyd, and John and Naomi Beattie. But I hear you ask, who was Lady Haberfield? Well, Sarah, Lady Haberfield, died on 5th December 1874 from bronchitis. She was the widow of Sir John Curl Haberfield, who had been Mayor of Bristol 6 times. As they had no family, she made provision for certain bequests to individuals and charities, obviously including the RNLI. She also used the proceeds from her estate to be used for the erection and endowment of almshouses for people in need from the ancient parishes of St Mary Redcliffe and Clifton and Bristol. This is one of those pulling and sailing lifeboats. This is lifeboats. This is the Elizabeth Lloyd. The weakness of the pull and saving lifeboats in rough weather was always apparent, but it was cruelly exposed when trying to rescue the crew of the schooner Sarah Ellen of Liverpool on 20th of February 1877 during a particularly strong gale, when she was forced to come back to shore to take on extra rowers, as she was not able to get far enough out to sea to put up a sail. One of those to jump in and help row was John James, a married man and father of 2, who died of cold and exhaustion during the rescue. He is the only crew member to have died on service, and there is now an award named after him. This is the John and Naomi Beattie, which was in service in the early part of the 20th century. This is, obviously, it's a summer view. They're not raining, they've got parasols up. It never rains in Aberystwyth in the summer. But you can see this would have been the quarterly practice during the summer. It's about circa 1910, and you can see the enormous amount of interest that the lifeboat created, with people crowding just to see it. The potential weakness of the pulling and saving lifeboats was only overcome with the advent of motorboats, powered by diesel engines, and with the arrival of this vessel, Frederick Angus, in 1932. You can see it's equally popular. People haven't discriminated between pulling and sailing and motorboats. But there was one unintended consequence of the new motorboat, and that was its greater weight, making it far more difficult to drag through the streets to launch. A possible solution was to build a new lifeboat house on or near the promenade. Money was raised towards this, but wartime contingencies obstructed the process, and the money, much of it raised by local students during their Rag Week activities, was used to purchase instead a crawler tractor to pull Frederick Angus, Lady Harrison, and later Aguila Wren through the streets of Aberystwyth. In 1951, Aberystwyth acquired a new lifeboat, the Aguila Wren. Aguila Wren was named in memory of 21 Wrens, women of the Women's Royal Naval Service, killed when the merchant ship Aguila was torpedoed sailing in convoy to Gibraltar. One of the 21 casualties was Kathleen Miller from Llanbaden, making the arrival of the new state-of-the-art lifeboat Aguila Wren, bought with funds raised in memory of the Wrens in 1951, particularly poignant. In fact, on hearing of the tragedy, most other women in the other Wrens gave a day's pay towards creating a memorial to their colleagues. Apparently, the convoy in which the Aguila sailed was the first one to be attacked by one of the U-boat wolf packs, so it was infamous in more ways than one. In fact, Kathleen Miller's mother is one of the people on the podium there during the naming ceremony. By the 1960s, and with rising costs, thought was given to modernising the service, and the decision to dispense with large heavy motorboats in favour of smaller inflatable craft was considered. Aberystwyth then became the first station to be equipped with inshore rescue boats, and I think if I show you the next sequence you can see why that would be necessary. This is removing the lifeboat from the lifeboat station in Queen's Road, dragging it round into Bath Street, up Bath Street, taking out a couple of cars on the way, and then it had to reverse round the corner into Bath Street in order to be able to push the boat into the sea. These are from September 1952. How do we know this? Because the film showing in the Coliseum is The Quiet Man, which was a film starring John Wayne putting on a fake Irish accent. And eventually we managed to get the boat onto the beach. I don't think those two are from the same sequence, but they serve the purpose. But also, retrieving the boat after it had been launched could also prove quite problematic, as we can see in these two images. So replacing a Gwyn Wren now can be seen as far-sighted, despite the fact there were many local protests at the time against losing such a prestigious vessel. She was eventually put on service in Redcar. But in many, many respects, times had changed. The nature of rescues had changed. Few were now related to shipping and more concerned with persons cut off by the tide or in trouble on small boats or dinghies or lilos or engaged in other forms of leisure activities. Consequently, a smaller, fast, manoeuvrable craft was better suited to this kind of work. Also, by the early 1960s, car ownership was growing and the prospect of hauling a wooden lifeboat through the streets of Aberystwyth, especially in summer, was going to become more and more troublesome, and more importantly, time-consuming. Add this to the fact that the lifeboat hadn't actually been called out for 4 years, and the argument seems to look compelling. There followed trials in 1963 with a small inflatable dinghy, probably similar to this. It's a Gwyn Martin photo, by the way. Initially, it was thought that vessels like this would be only for use in the summer months, but by 1964, the RNLI decided that Aberystwyth would be the first station in Britain to change to entirely inshore rescue boats. A further advantage was that these boats could be kept at the harbour from where they could be safely launched, except at the very lowest tides, and when South Beach would be available anyway. Over the next 20 years, 6 different D-class inflatables were stationed here and housed in one of the sheds on the town quay. All were identified by their number and not by their name. I've got pictures of 2 of them from Gwyn Martin's collection here. I'm sure if I was to search, I would find more. There, I think we've got Ray Shakespeare there on the right. I think it might be Tommy Ridgway on the left. I'm not sure who's in the middle. And we've got Endeavour over by the St David's Quay. These D-class boats were then followed by a twin-engine C-class boat called Oates, which we see here, circa 1983. But in 1993, a new boathouse was built for Aberystwyth's new and much larger Atlantic 21 all-weather lifeboat, which is called the Wolverson X-Ray, and its launching tractor. The Wolverson X-Ray was on service here from 1993 to 1994. There then followed a succession of Atlantic-class lifeboats, each requiring a crew of 4. Here we've got Enid Mary, Spirit of Friendship, and the present boat, which is Florence and Ernest Bowles. In addition, a small Arancia-class inflatable requiring only 2 crew and primarily for surf life-saving duties has been stationed here since 2012. One of only 2 stations in Wales to have such a vessel, the other being in Criccieth. Another first for Aberystwyth was when the Arancia class was taken into Holy Trinity Church to be blessed in 2013, an event that made the front page of the Times the following day. Another claim of a first is that of having the first all-female crew on a rescue, though I understand this is also disputed by Cardigan, so we won't go into that. And another recent event worthy of note was the visit of Jack Lowe as part of his lifeboat project. He's attempting to document every lifeboat station in Britain using a wooden Victorian camera and a converted ambulance as his darkroom. The National Library has purchased a number of his photographs of Welsh lifeboat crews, including this of the Aberystwyth crew. I put details of his website there. I spoke to him when getting permission to use this, and he's very keen that you should know that an exhibition of 80 of his prints is now in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, so I'm sure next time you're in London you'll make an effort to go and see them. So what, if any, was the effect of moving to the harbour had on the RNLI? Well, today the RNLI is a slick, it's a well-run organisation with excellent fundraising and publicity arms and volunteers. It's helped by TV adverts and drama series. But back in 1964, when the RNLI decamped to the harbour, things were different. We've seen how a quarterly launch on the main beach attracted the crowds and therefore raised the profile locally and amongst those who did not live on the coast. Moving the lifeboat away to the harbour and reducing the boat to an inflatable devalued it as a spectacle and lowered its profile. The only reminder that there was a lifeboat would be the sound of the 2 maroons used to summon the crew, which again was scrapped in 2008 in favour of pages. During much of the 1990s, Donald Smythe, who was secretary of the lifeboat, the RNLI here, lived next door to me, so I was always very well aware when the maroons went up. Of course, moving to the harbour made absolute sense. How on earth would you be able to manoeuvre a boat and tractor from Queen's Road to the beach today? How many 4x4s would you scratch in the way? Likewise, whilst the whole team had to be assembled to launch a boat like the Aquila Wren, a small rib needing a crew of 2 and perhaps 1 or 2 others to launch would be in the water far sooner than waiting for a whole crew to arrive. So what about the harbour today? Well, if I read from a yachting website, the approach should be treated with caution in strong onshore winds. Beware of cross tides and boulders around the head of the South Pier, the Stone Pier and the Trap, an area of rough ground which is to the north of the wooden jetty. Really, it's not too far away from what Lewis Morris said back in 1745. There are now 19 fishing boats registered in Aberystwyth, though this includes boats that work from Cardigan, Newquay, Aberdyfi and Barmouth. On the town quay, there's a small fleet of 10 or so inshore fishing boats, almost all exclusively engaged in fishing for shellfish, lobsters, prawns, scallops and crabs. Most of the registered boats are quite small, they're under 10 metres. Scallop fishing tends to be carried out in the winter, very often by visiting boats, while lobsters dominate the fishing in the summer months. Our harbour may not be an industrial hub it once was, nor a window to the wider world, with the prospect of employment and advancement for the adventurous, as it was 150 years ago. But it's still an important resource. Apart from the shellfish industry, it serves as a hub for a number of leisure activities, in particular rowing, kayaking and dinghy sailing, to name a few. And of course, it's dominated by a 165-berth marina, which is still for sale. So, thank you very much. Can I just mention outside we have a table with 2 volunteers from the RNLI. They're here not just to raise funds. There are leaflets about ways that you can help the RNLI as well. You can be an RNLI volunteer without getting wet. You can help with fundraising or with PR or with organising events. So please do have a look at the table on your way out. Thank you very much.
Just very quickly to thank Wil again for what has been an amazing and fascinating talk. I could listen all afternoon. I'm lucky I've got meetings or I wouldn't let him go. And I'm lobbying heavily at the moment for some Gwyn Martin talks as well, which I'm sure people would be really interested. Look how many people are nodding.
Yes, yes. I'll do them. I don't mind.
So before you go, just want to mention our 2 next events, which is Cato Cymru, the Wales Map Symposium on the 17th of May, and then Gareth Jones, The Life and Afterlife of a Welsh Hero, on the 22nd of May here. Please have a look at our website, and it will all this stuff will be on social media as well. But thank you very much for coming. If you haven't seen it, go and see the exhibition that's still on upstairs. But again, thank you, Wil, and I hope to see you soon in the Gwyn Martin talk, Wil.
Yeah, no problem.
Diolch yn fawr iawn.